The last emperor of China, or Puyi, once said, "The forbidden state has become theater without an audience." So why did the actors remain on stage? Hello, this is me, Dodge Venice, and today we are going to talk about the Qing. Most history enthusiasts do not really know much about the history of the Qing. Most people just know the Qing for the Opium Wars, but it is really important to understand Qing China and its downfall to understand modern China. A very strange thing about the Qing was that they weren't technically Chinese. The Ming Dynasty was invaded by the Manchus, which were based in Manchuria. This brought good things. First, it made minorities like the Tibetans happy. They also introduced imperial testing, which allowed people to climb the ladder easier. Also, the Qing had the Mandate of Heaven on their side. However, it also caused tension because of the Han population and, being conquered. They also forced all of the Han to adopt their hairstyle to Q, and nobody wants this goofy haircut, so people obviously revolted. So instead of just agreeing with them, yeah, their haircut looks kind of stupid, they massacred them. The Manchus, who took over, brought in their military system, known as the Four Banner System. The system was created when the Nurachi united the Manchus, and to shortly summarize, every household was sworn to a company, and every company was sworn to a different banner. At first, there were 4 colored banners: yellow, white, red, and blue. But then, while uniting Manchuria, they were more creative by adding a different colored border. This system was also the inspiration for the Qing Empire flag, which was the banner army that Nurachi led, the yellow one. And after invading the Ming, there were banners created for the Chinese and the Mongols. But the banner system was not just military, it was also a very important aspect of life, because bannermen were essentially nobles, like the samurai in Japan. But the ethnicity aspect in the banner system was very complex as well, which is a very big part of the banner system. Some Han became more Manchu, and some Manchu became more Chinese. And some Manchu adopted Han children, and some Han adopted Manchu children, which really complicated the system. Another flaw was that the Manchu population, which were above the Han, were way too small of a population to be the only ruling ethnicity, which is why the Qing dynasty is known as a Chinese dynasty, because most of the population was Chinese. This also made the Chinese rise up to power, making the Manchus some minority. But surprisingly, in the 17th century, their system was pretty successful. There was also the Green Standard Army, which is a sort of military police that handled Ming loyalist rebellions in the south. After the Ming loyalists were crushed on the mainland, they fled to the island of Taiwan. Sound familiar? The only difference is that they didn't survive very long. But how come Taiwan didn't fall faster today? Well, it's simple diplomacy. China's economy is purely based on trade, and if the invasion of Taiwan happens, they'll be sanctioned, and it will basically be suicide to launch an invasion. After the suppression of the Ming Rebellion, the Emperor Kangxi has brought many guards to the Qing, conquering Mongolia and Tibet. They also started a war with the Dzungars. However, they also did some terrible things. Not morally, though. It wasn't like there was a massacre. They started a coastal ban. The Ming made an isolation policy, which didn't allow the production of boats, which will backfire in the future a lot. But the Qing, fearing the Ming loyalists rising up again, made it so that people couldn't live on the coast, or 25 kilometers off the coast. This enactment was also called the Great Clearance. This prohibited any trade, turning money power hubs into ruins. After this, they launched another campaign against the Dzungars, which used half of the treasury. The Emperor, Yongxiang, was also a cosplayer, dressing up as the Dalai Lama and a European fighting in line. After the death of Yongxiang, he was succeeded by Xianglong, who conquered the Kosher Mongols and the Dzungars. But while, quote-unquote, pacifying the region, they committed a genocide of 450,000 individuals, or 80% of the population. But long before the century of humiliation, or the 19th century, there were many revolts, which were mostly ethnic and religious, like in conquered territories of Tibet and Dzungar. And now, one of my favorite topics on the Qing dynasty, secret societies. That's right, China had many secret societies. You can't even name all of them, including one known as the Shaolin monks, which are basically Buddhist monk ninjas. But secret societies don't stop there. They will continue for all of Qing China's history. Another very important society is the White Lotus Society, which will cause a very important rebellion, which will end the Qing dynasty's golden age, and basically start the century of humiliation. During this rebellion, the Qing realized their war machine was not as powerful as they thought it was, and would become the laughingstock of the world. But the White Lotus did more than that. They were a very old society, starting during the Yuan Mongol dynasty, and also starting the Red Turban Rebellion, which will also be highly detrimental to the Qing. The banner army system also proved to be inefficient, making the bannermen very important and strong in the politics of the Qing dynasty, which is also a problem with the Ottomans, making Janissaries have strong political ties in the Ottoman government. The same would go to the Green Standard Army, which is also very useless. So the Qing just became geniuses. They saw how terrible their soldiers were and brought back horses and bows. And when their neighbor Russia started to use guns while hunting, they got mad and demanded them to stop using guns and return to bow. After that, James Flint, wanting to make a better place to trade, since the one that was required had traffic, went to Tianjin to talk with the emperor to be allowed to trade in a different region. The Qing, being very sensible, said no and restricted trade entirely. But after a while, the Qing realized it's a pretty goofy idea and allowed trade again. So the East India Company started selling opium to the Qing, making everybody high. This also brought Christianity in the south, which will be a pretty big problem in the future. Back to opium, Lin Zexu has tried to ban opium, burning it into fires, and there are no official records of this, but I think after he did that, and the people around him became stoners. And because of the restriction of trading opium, the first opium war broke out. China could have supported 800,000 individuals for the war, 200,000 of which would have muskets. But the government was so stoned on opium, they just said, nah, let's just do 100,000. And even those 100,000 people weren't ready. While the Brits had about 5,000 soldiers and about 10,000 Marines. This might seem like the British are outnumbered, but the Brits had very good veteran soldiers and better tech. And China had never fought an international war, so they were also very bad at fighting. Also, the banner system that the Qing had strongly divided the army, which made the Qing have multiple small armies that acted on their own instead of one huge group. But then the Sikh Empire declared war on the Chinese, and China had to make peace with the British. The British won, making China give Hong Kong and also getting rid of the Cantonese system. And then Christianity started to spread even more, and one of those converts were Hong Jishuan. He claimed to be the brother of Jesus, launching the Taiping Rebellion. This rebellion was one of the biggest wars in history. For comparison, World War II had about 50 million deaths, while the Taiping Rebellion had 20 million. That is about half the death count for World War II. During this chaos, the Qing saw a boat and seized it, but since the ship belonged to the British, the Second Opium War started. The British were joined by the French and the Americans, and unsurprisingly, the Chinese were beaten. They were forced to pay reparations and expanded the territory of Britain, or Hong Kong, in China. But one important treaty that happened was between the Russians, which took half of Manchuria. After this, the Xianfeng Emperor died. The Chongji Emperor succeeded, but the emperor had two dowages, Cixi and Xian. So they united with Prince Gong and started a coup, which made Cixi the one in power instead of both Xian and Cixi. And Prince Gong made some very important reforms. One of those were the establishment of modern armies, which is a huge problem and humiliation of the Qing. But they did not do this by themselves. They had European military specialists like Charles George Gordon. They also used French and Russian weapons. Some of the elite armies that were made were the Xiang Army, the Peking Field Force, and the ever-victorious army. The Xiang and ever-victorious army, however, would be disbanded, and the White Army would emerge in the place of the Xiang. The Qing also set up actually good naval shipyards. These military reforms helped put down the rebellions in Qing China. But of course, good old Qing will always have some major problem. So they lost control over all of their territories, and the banditries and tomfoolery increased within the country. But it doesn't stop there. No. They fled China, went to Vietnam, and the government had to use guns on elephants to kick them. But how come Japan had much higher success in their reforms than the Qing? And the reason for that is because the Meiji Restoration, or the New World of Japan, had fully ousted the shogun, allowing for much easier reforms. But the Qing still maintained the status quo, and everything was run by the emperor. But some tension was happening between the West and the Qing. The Germans and the Australians believed in the Yellow Terror, while the Qing were mad that the West didn't like their culture and started spreading their religion. In China, they still practiced foot binding, which is something like this. and the West spoke out against that. The Qing didn't really like that. However, Empress Sisi has actually been doing some shenanigans to restore her power, because the palace is currently very corrupted. So at first she lowered Prince Gong's power to advisor, and put more loyal people like Prince Chun in higher power. In the midst of all the rebellions that were happening over the Qing dynasty, one happened in Korea, known as the Donghak Rebellion. The Qing obviously sent troops there, but the Japanese said,
Well, actually, we made a treaty where you can't have troops in this area, so this is a violation of the treaty.
and the first Sino-Japanese war started. And we all know that the Qing are going to lose, but let's talk about why. China might have modernized, but it was hella slow. But they were still using bows and pikes instead of guns. And another problem, which came back through the years, was opium. That's right, the soldiers were still stoned, and they cosplayed as furries to scare away the enemy. And it might not have worked on the Japanese, but it certainly worked on the officers. And can you blame a person for being scared of a furry? Like, I don't want to be in a mile radius within these things. However, some reasons will show up from the first opium war, like the problem that their military is trash and there was high corruption. But since China didn't build the railroads to Manchuria because it didn't want people to immigrate there, the soldiers instead had to go over water and the boats were sunk by the Japanese. This issue also lowered the supplies shipped to the area, which made the troops fight much worse. After the Sino-Japanese War, the European powers just said, we want a piece of China, and they started making plans. And it almost went into action, but one man named John Hay who said, let's just force them to be more free with trade instead. And surprisingly, everyone said yes. This made all nations trade equally with the Qing, which wasn't bad at all compared to what was going to happen. After this miracle, China started making military reforms again, which would help put a central command before the army, which is something China desperately needed. This army was led by a man named Yuan Shikai, and instead of having the army belong to a government, just like always, it became loyal to Shikai instead. And Sisi, being a bit unhappy, launched a coup again, with people like Ronglu and Prince Da, which also installed anti-foreign sentiment. At first, this might seem like a good thing, that foreign powers were always doing something with China, and this would seem like a boss girl mode for Sisi. But instead, the government was ruled by conservatives, which was less willing to do any reforms. And there was, guess what, another secret society, and it was known as the Fists of Harmony and Justice, or the Boxers, which, just like Sisi and other leaders, hated foreigners, so they allied with them. Instead of hating foreigners and the government, it hates the foreigners and loves the government. And from that made China was to ban the imperial testing, which might seem like she is keeping the government to the monarchy, but this testing system actually caused a lot of corruption. It was very important. After this great reform, Sisi and the prince died. The prince was poisoned by guess who? Good old Sisi. However, there's a good reason for that, because he could have ruined the country and take control. But compared with the person she wanted to rule the country, Puyi, who is literally 4, this is a very stupid move, because either way the same results will happen. This small toddler will get manipulated, and the country will turn to chaos, which is where we will see the collapse of the Qing starting to appear. Then a man who came from Hawaii, Sun Yat-sen, tried to start a revolution, and that started a wave of political chaos and revolutions. Then the government decided it would be a good idea to let people study outside of China. This brought in ideas of anarchism and communism.
I call myself a communist queer because I'm a non-binary, bisexual, polyamorous whore. A queer for the people, done by the people.
Version to be built by the local government. But then, that right was sold off to the foreigners, which honestly is really mind-boggling because of the highly anti-foreign government of the Qing. So obviously, people rebelled, and doing this, a lot of organizations like the Progressive Association and the Literary Society tried to take advantage and started planning. But while they were making a bomb, it exploded, revealing that most of the people who were in the revolution were from the army. So the army got scared, and they took over the local government where they were stationed. This success encouraged even more revolutions. The Toginha took all of South China. Then the north of Mongolia declared independence. But no one really cared because there's nothing there. Tibet also became independent. And surprisingly, the west of China didn't declare independence. That was because of a person named Ma Anliang, who helped the Qing hold down this territory. Then Yuan Shikai, yes, the guy that wanted to take the Qing dynasty, actually did, and became the prime minister of course, he still has to deal with the rebellions. And he didn't. He got took down from power when the rebels took Nanjing. And honestly, I feel kind of sad. I mean, this guy was the original. He wanted to do this at first. He was having malicious plans his whole life. And then he just got took down from power. Just kidding, he'll be in power later. But now the rebels have to choose a new leader to lead this new dynasty. And they chose Sun Yat-sen, the president of the Chinese Republic. They then signed peace, and both sides got a very fair deal. The Qing got southern China back, which was the most important part, and the rebels got a republic. They established the Kuomintang under Song Jiaran. The Kuomintang controlled both houses of the government, and all they needed to do was lower the power of Yuan Shikai. But oh no, Song Jiaran got assassinated! Who could it be? It was never proven that Yuan planned this killing, but we all know he had to do something with it. So the whole republic fell down and Yuan Shikai formed an autocratic regime. At first, no one really cared because, they always lived under an autocracy. But when the Great War started, Japan joined and took German colonies in China. But Japan also decided to do some trolling. What Japan did is basically say, can we have full control over your country, but not officially? So, I can take stuff from your country and do whatever I want in this country. And Yuan Shikai, out of pure fear, just said, yeah. And that's when the people got pissed. They're like, hey, our leader's a pussy. He took commands from that stupid Japanese-looking dude. Let's kill him. And the friends of Yuan Shikai, like Duan Qiri, said, you know what? He is kind of a pussy. So they created their own political factions. And then Yunnan, a revolution, started by Kai Yi. This began the National Protection War. Then Yuan Shikai died after 90 days of ruling. And Li Yuanhong became the president. Then Duan Qiri got power and helped Li Yonghuang slowly got more power, and then Li himself. After that, chaos ensued, because Li really wanted to participate in World War I, and to convince people to do so, he tried to scare the parliament into joining World War I, so the government was divided between Li and Zhang Jun, who was a monarchist, and Duan Qiri with his army, who were the Republicans. However, Li actually had more popularity than Duan, because Li wanted to restore the monarchy, and most of the people in China like monarchism more than republicanism. So Li and Zhang Jun went to the Forbidden Palace and made Puyi emperor again. So Duan came over there and bombarded the palace. Then Li just gave up and made Feng Guozhang president, and Duan Qiri premier. Duan marched to Beijing, which is where the royalists were located, and overwhelmed them. Then Sun Yat-sen returned and started a revolution again. This was called the Constitutional Protection Movement, and a fun fact about China during the Great War, they never actually fought. Instead, they had many workers help work for the countries, which would still grant them a seat at the peace table. So the soldiers weren't out fighting, they stayed inside. China, just waiting for another revolution to start, which it did. And Duan, of course, led his troops to the revolution to destroy it. There were two problems, of course. The first one was that the president never said he could do so. The second was that he failed miserably. And he did what he did before. He grabbed his troops and forced Feng to make him premier again. Zhang Zhoulin, a friend of Duan, helped him make him premier, and it worked again. But after Feng finished his term, Zhu Xichang came to power, and he was actually kind of a genius. He made Zhang and Duan make their own cliques called the Zhili clique, which supported Zhang, and the Anhui clique, which supported Duan, and made them fight against each other, so they will never start any of their tomfoolery again. The Anhui clique took loans from the Japanese to take down the rebellion in the south, and the people were very mad because the clique took loans from their worst enemy. So they started the May 4th movement, and this was actually a very important movement which united the middle class with the working class. The movement boycotted Japanese goods. The protesters also wanted World War I to continue, so anyone who wanted to sign the Treaty of Versailles was attacked, and this actually worked, and anyone who wanted to sign it was fired. The movement also tore down old buildings and temples because they were that progressive, which kind of sounds like what communist China did. That's because the Cultural Revolution was highly inspired by the May the 4th movement. But Duan didn't care about the major movement in China. He focused more on the fact that Mongolia exists. So even Zhu's system of dividing the two premiers failed. So Duan yet again ignored the president and launched a war on Mongolia because he really wanted Mongolia. And so Mongolia was surprised that someone actually cared about them. They didn't have a big military, and most people didn't like, especially Zhang, because Duan's military was on his borders. So Zhang declared war on him, and because of that, they declared war on him. Duan didn't get to keep Mongolia and had to withdraw his troops. And this war started the warlord period. This included the Anhui clique, the Zhili clique, the Southern Rebellion, Western China, which supported the White Russians. The rest were just different warlords fighting between each other. This also officially ended the Qing Empire and starting the Republic of China. So what did we learn? Why did the Qing fall? Well, there are two answers for that. The first was that the Qing had a huge population spurt, which disorganized the country. It had many famines, which had great instability. The second was the banner system. The banner system made it so the army was strongly divided and not unified, which tanked the Qing military a ton. The third reason is China was just very conservative and wasn't ready for change. They didn't care that Britain won over them with 5,000 troops to 100,000. They didn't care that they lost a war to Japan, who was literally in their sphere of influence for centuries. However, there were lots of other factors. These were the biggest ones. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to sexually harass the subscribe button and molest the like button. In the next video, I'll be talking about the Republic of China. About the Chinese Civil War and China's fight with Japan. The three dominant cliques of China are Zhili, Anhui, and Fengtian. And there was one underdog in the south of China, known as Kuomintang, led by none other than Sun Yat-sen. In 1920, Zhili and Fengtian united to attack the Anhui clique, and they were so easy that the war ended in 9 days, lasting from July the 14th to July the 23rd. But let's take a detour on the leaders of the Zhili and Fengtian. The leader of the Fengtian clique was Zhang Zhoulin. Zhang Zhoulin was a huge supporter of the Japanese, and it was no secret. His clique was very dependent on the Japanese, which is what made the Fengtian clique the most powerful in the region. In fact, he formed Manchurian gangs and helped Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. Now let's move on to Wu Peifu, the leader of the Zhili clique. He began to grow cautious of the Fengtian clique. Not only are they the strongest power in the region, but they also have an alliance with Japan, which is a hated power in all of China. So as tensions grew between each other, he denounced the Fengtian clique for siding with Japan. Now, since we're on the topic of alliances, I think it is time to mention the allies of the other tribes. The Kuomintang's ally was actually, strangely, the USSR, even though the Kuomintang had communist supporters that were suppressed. And Zhili's ally was Italy, a new fascist power out of Europe. European mercenaries were actually very common, with very interesting stories, such as Sun Yat-sen's bodyguard known as Abraham Two-Armed Cohen, who was a Polish-born British and Canadian adventurer of Jewish origin, who not only was a bodyguard, but a very important general in the army. Then there was Frank One-Armed Sutton, who was Sun Yat-sen's second bodyguard. He has earned the nickname One-Armed because he lost his arm. But he was not just a bodyguard. He had many hustles during his lifetime, which included being a general for Zhang Zhoulin, selling mortars illegally to Chinese overlords, mining gold in Serbia, and also building railways in the countries of Argentina and Mexico. The uneasy alliance between the Zhili and Fengtian wouldn't last long, ending on April 10th of 1922, when the first Zhili-Fengtian War started, with the Kuomintang and Anhui joining on the side of Fengtian. But the war ended after 2 months, which made Zhili occupy Beijing, with the Zhili casualties being so low that there aren't even any specific casualties for the war compared to Fengtian's 20,000 casualties, 10,000 desertion, and 40,000 surrender. Even though Zhili had 20,000 troops less and fighting against 3 fronts. But while the Zhili clique celebrated the taking of the Fengtian's capital, Zhang started a huge military reform and scheming for his revenge, which made the generals more powerful, unlike before, where they were literally gang leaders. While it may have looked that the Zhili clique was high and mighty, it was a very unstable clique with people like Feng Yuxiang and Cao Kun just waiting for the right moment. But then the second Zhili-Fengtian War broke out. But the Zhili clique was fighting on 2 fronts. Not only were they fighting against the Fengtian faction, who had 50,000 more men in strength, but also they had to fight against Feng Yuxiang, who started the Beijing coup, which started on October of 1924. This gave an overwhelming advantage to Zhang Zhoulin, and a looming end to the Geely clique. As the Geely clique lost the war, which ended this clique. This is known as the most important war in the Chinese warlord era. But as the Fengtian clique was celebrating their win against the Geely clique, Sun Yat-sen, the leader of Kuomintang, used something none of the leaders actually had, which is stability. No one, and I mean no one, liked the warlord system, not even the leaders of the cliques themselves, who wanted to unite China. But while every other warlord never really cared about this fact, Sun Yat-sen manipulated this fact and used this to have an infinite stability glitch. Not for long though. Stability allowed the clique to last long, unlike the others, which ended them. So Sun Yat-sen, who was an important figure in the previous Chinese Republic in 1918, which we talked about in the last episode, he said that he will remake this republic and unite China, which made him a huge competitor in the region. Another important individual for the Kuomintang was Chiang Kai-shek, or, let's be real, his name is Shrek, who was one of the greatest generals of the Kuomintang and supported the National Revolution, which is one of the Kuomintang's greatest armies. They started an operation on the rebels of the Geely clique, which triggered a war against the Fengtian clique. As the Fengtian clique came later, the Kuomintang had an advantage, and they won, taking all of the Geely territory from the Fengtian clique. But the Kuomintang alliance with the USSR started to break down, and the same came to the CCP. But the Kuomintang was not the only warlord nation to lose an alliance. The Fengtian clique had an encounter with Japan, which started a battle, which lowered relations dramatically. So they supposedly assassinated Zhang Zhou-lin, so his heir united with the Kuomintang, which ended the Chinese warlord period in the December of 1928. Now let's go forward 3 years, 9 years. The Second Sino-Japanese War is highly debated on the date of the war. Some historians believe it was when Japan entered Manchuria, but others believe it started during the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. But most historians believe it started in 1937, so we will stick to this date in this video. Also, this is very interesting, but Nazi Germany actually supported China. Yeah, and they never actually officially supported Japan. But the Axis was a very weird alliance in general, which we will discuss in a video soon. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attack on Malay, the war officially merged with World War II. Some scholars even believe the Second Sino-Japanese War to be the start of World War II. The war started because Japan wanted more resources, and apparently they are a competition in the textile industry. But we all know that's cap, and they just hate China and want more land. The invasion of Manchuria gave them Manchukuo, which was a puppet state, and allowed them to attack the Chinese from more fronts. The Chinese had something Japan didn't, and that's manpower. China had, and still has, for now, the highest population in the world. After the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan swiftly took the cities of Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. This is also when the massacre of Nanjing happened. The casualties of this incident is very debated. In fact, there are whole articles and pages on the casualties of this tragic incident. China then got a huge ally, the USSR. They signed a pact which gave a huge advantage to them. But after China's victory in Changsha and Guangxi, the front didn't change. That doesn't mean the war is over. China still has two other important allies, which are the CCP and America. The CCP started communist rebellions in Shanxi and Nanning, which really exhausted the Japanese forces. But the CCP also launched a huge counteroffensive in Central Asia, which was highly aggressive and successful, counting to 50,000 casualties on the side of the Japanese. Their motto is 3 alls, known as kill all, burn all, and destroy all. In fact, it was so aggressive, Mao never launched a guerrilla campaign again. But that doesn't mean the National Revolutionary Army and the CCP were friends, which isn't really surprising if you know anything about the political compass. They frequently abandoned each other in multiple battles and obviously didn't agree on many things. Now let's move on to China's second ally, America. America increased its aid to China to $20 billion in modern day after the Pearl Harbor attack. They also had super cool and epic mercenaries known as the Flying Tigers, which is actually very useful since China didn't have airplanes as their own at the time. In fact, their whole air force was filled with American and Soviet models, except for the Chu XB-0. The Japanese lost after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which ended its war with Japan, or the Asian Holocaust, with 10 to 20 million casualties and a whopping 80 to 100 million refugees. Thank you for watching, and in the next video, I will finish off this 3-part series of modern China with a talk about the CCP, the Great Leap, and much more.
The all-new Google Pixel 6. It's smart enough to make photobombers go poof. With Magic Eraser. On the first ever all-Google phone. Google Pixel 6. For all you are.
The History of the PRC by Doja Venice. Who is Mao Zedong? Mao Zedong was a Confucian-hating liberal who was obsessed with Sun Yat-sen. He overthrew the government in 1949, and the escapees fled to Taiwan. He also was a huge member of the Long March, which basically helped a ton with Mao Zedong taking over the government. Also killed a ton of businessmen. And he gave the money to the poor, but it's fine. He's like Robin Hood, right, guys? Yeah. He also did the 3 anti and 5 anti campaign, which, first of all, is a stupid name. Like 3 plus 5 is 8. It could have been just the 8 anti campaign, but no, it's either 3 and 5. But despite of the stupid name, it ruined the economies of Shanghai, Tianjin, and Chongqing. He also started the anti-rightist movement, which was basically an excuse to kill people, which are usually smart. And this suggests that all rightists are very, very smart. He also tried to end the friendship with the USSR very hard and didn't like them at all, as most people would assume. Which is very weird because most propaganda makes them seem like a gay couple. But Mao Zedong was also famous for the Great Leap Forward, in quotations, and the Cultural Revolution. And the political officials were really scared of Mao, so they just told him that everything was fine and you don't have to worry about anything. Which made him think that everything is fine. The Cultural Revolution also had many, many starvations. He also forced them to do collective farming. Now, what is collective farming? Well, collective farming is the basis of multiple civilizations like the Aztecs, the Iroquois, and the Russian Empire. Which is why many countries today allow people to voluntarily do collective farming. The problem that China did was that they forced them to. But it wasn't that bad. They banned opium, child marriages, and foot binding. They also had a backyard blast furnace plan, which made citizens make steel in their backyard, which was very effective. But compared to all the other things they did, it doesn't even come close. But this was just the second. The first one made the gross output of agriculture go from 30% to 56%. They had also doubled the heavy industry, and the grain and rice production went through the roof, which makes sense why they would do it again. But the Great Leap Forward permanently damaged China for a long, long time. Now, let's move on to the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution basically said that, made it seem that, made Mao Zedong seem and look that it doesn't look that his country's not communist enough. So, he made the Red Guard, which is basically an army made out of university students. And it's also this little red book, which is basically the same thing as the Holy Bible for every Chinese person at the time. He also started revolutions in his own country because they weren't quote-unquote communist enough. And then those revolutions fought against each other. It ended in 1969, but technically ended in 1976, like being very dumb in general. But then Mao Zedong died, and Hua Guofeng was here to take over. Then the Gang of Four was preying on his downfall, which was the support group for Mao Zedong. And on October 6th, 1976, they were arrested. And people were really happy because that was a symbol of the end of the Cultural Revolution. And that's why people really liked Hua Guofeng. Not only did he arrest the Gang of Four, but he also made multiple propaganda of himself, making him seem like the best leader ever. But Hua Guofeng made him seem like a monarchy, with Mao Zedong being the god. But his ideas were really stale, and made him seem like a clone of Mao Zedong. But he also opened up more schools, and made nuclear and space programs. Then Deng Xiaoping took over. He was really obsessed with having good relations with the US, and he is considered to be one of the best leaders of China. And Deng Xiaoping had more ruling experience than Hua Guofeng, and made him seem like he had more fresh ideas than Hua Guofeng's stale ideas. He also set up term limits, which basically made it so presidents and leaders couldn't lead forever. He also made the 863 program, which helps university students. And while for the negotiations of Hong Kong with Britain, he created the One Country, Two Systems enactment, which basically made Hong Kong, Macau, and future to be Taiwan, as they said, they will be an autonomous region of China, well, with having their own economic systems, but officially being part of China. But after Tiananmen Square, this age was over. Only 9% of you are subscribed, and the Chinese government is running after me. So please subscribe.